Top 10 worst raid bosses. Now, when I say the worst raid bosses, I don't necessarily mean difficult. There can be fights that are hard, but not bad. The most recent example would have to be Heroic. The fight is definitely challenging and long to boot, but each phase has its own set of difficulties that can be overcome with relatively simple raid coordination, once you get the gist of it. And with good enough gear and coordination, it will just go down in time and leave you satisfied after killing it. And then there are raid fights that just suck ass. You know the ones. If you have to ask in trade chat for a pug on a certain boss, but you hesitate to type out the boss's name, bosses so bad because they rely so heavily on a gimmick that it's just plain annoying or unnecessarily long, those are the bosses that will be on this list. Number 10 on this list is the textbook example of a long and boring fight, the Madness of Deathwing. Now, before I talk about how terrible Madness was, I should probably say I actually liked Spine of Deathwing, which is usually everyone's most hated fight, but I agree with the masses on how bad Madness is. The fight is basically fighting a tentacle in front, tentacle in the back, little tentacles that spawn out of the main tentacle, and then killing some adds and a bolt that required a raid cooldown depending on which order you did the platforms. Now, that doesn't sound so bad until you realize that's 90% of the fight. Doing the same thing over and over again, 4 times for 10 minutes straight before going on to the last burn phase. I did this fight a couple hundred times back in Cataclysm and got server second on the heroic kill, and it's a fight I personally hate with a passion. But, luckily, there are even more bosses I hated more than this one, and that's why it's this high on the list and not further down. Now then, number 9 on this list is Vanilla Naxx 4 Horsemen. Why is this fight so bad? Well, it's the first and only fight in the game to require 8 tanks to do. That's right, 8 tanks. You could have cheesed the fight a little and only bring 7 tanks if you did a convoluted tanking rotation, but even at 7 it is still higher than any other fight, like, ever. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that not only did you need 8 tanks, but you also needed the 8 tanks to be warriors with a 4-set bonus from a previous raid to make sure the taunt couldn't miss. Because otherwise there was a chance your taunt could miss, and if it missed, it was almost a guaranteed wipe. Although, to be fair, Vanilla WoW was Blizzard's testing ground for raids, so I'm not going to include too many of their weird fights on this list. Maybe like 1 or 2 more, tops. Blizzard found out that having an 8 tank fight was dumb and made the mechanic for Wrath 4 Horsemen not as retarded. Number 8 on this list, the Flame Leviathan. Wrath was when Blizzard introduced vehicle combat and tried to incorporate it into as many fights as possible. Consequently, almost every fight with vehicle mechanics is universally hated by players. Flame Leviathan will be the only one of those fights on this list. And why this fight over fights like Malygos and Gunship? Well, because 100% of the fight takes place in vehicles. The worst fight and otherwise one of the best raids in the game. Number 7 will be Tortos from Throne of Thunder. Specifically heroic mode, but normal mode was pretty bad as well. Why is this fight so bad? Well, because it's gimmicky as hell. 3 turtles come out that run around the room sending players flying in the air. You must DPS them down so that someone could kick one of them into the boss to interrupt his raid wipe mechanic. That doesn't sound so bad until you realize that you spend 3/4 of the fight dodging those annoying spinning turtles, and that to kick the turtle into the boss, you had to position yourself just right because they were trying to play homage to like Mario or something. I don't know, I just know we had way too many wipes because one of our DPS missed the boss. Now, heroic mode, for me healing anyway, made this fight like 10 times worse. I think Blizzard was just trying to make the most annoying fight ever, but then found a way to one-up themselves with a boss I'll talk about later. So anyway, about heroic mode. This fight introduced a shield mechanic where heals would add to the shield instead of actually healing you. Sounds great, right? Except it meant I couldn't use a couple of my healing spells or atonement at all as a disc priest. You see, in order for Prayer of Mending to actually bounce, players needed to take damage. If everyone always has a shield on them that breaks very infrequently, then Prayer of Mending won't bounce. And back then, it was actually pretty good to use. And for Atonement, which was also really good back then, it would heal the lowest health player. If someone's shield broke and they took damage before getting healed back up and getting a new shield, then they would be the lowest health target the whole fight, and Atonement would only target that one player the entire fight, making it not worth using. And like I said, Atonement was really good back then. So, the reason this boss is on this list is more of a personal grudge than anything else. Now, number 6 on this list is Netherspite. Netherspite is a gigantic nether dragon lurking in the celestial watch portion of Karazhan. Killing Netherspite required players to take turns absorbing various colored beams from 3 portals that spawn during certain phase of the fight. Basically, the entire fight is a huge game of uninteresting musical chairs, and after a few attempts, becomes enough to annoy even the most enthusiastic player. The only redeeming quality of this boss? Netherspite is totally optional boss in Karazhan and was skipped by nearly everyone. Number 5 is Cataclysm Nef. Vanilla Nef is a really hated boss as well, from people who had to do him when it was current, but I had enough problems with the Cataclysm version to warrant my own personal hatred for it. Why is this boss so bad? Well, because of a phase where the room gets filled with lava, and everyone has to swim to a platform and kill an ad while waiting for the phase to end. I died more times than I care to admit trying to get onto that stupid platform that had a little edge on it so you couldn't just swim straight up, but had to go at it at sort of an angle, and it was impossible if you lagged even a little bit during that part of the fight. Also, his crackle mechanic was annoying as well. It would hit everyone in the raid for about 100k nature damage every time he went down 10% of his health, and 100k damage was just about 80 to 90% of every non-tank's health back then. So you had to have the whole raid topped off and have cooldowns ready for when the DPS would push his health past a checkpoint. This boss actively discouraged high DPS, which isn't fun. Now, for number 4 on this list, a fight that I assumed was pitched like, hey, what if we fight some kind of water monster, but they have to, like, freeze it first before they can kill it? No. Not only should they have to freeze the monster, but have only physical damage be able to break the ice. Yeah. And then the boss literally cannot die until it's frozen first with frost magic, and broken by pure physical damage on a DPS check. You know, to make it challenging. Viscidus was the result of that hypothetical brainstorming situation, an ooze boss that had to be frozen with high amounts of frost damage, and then killed by burst physical damage. The only fight where spellcasters without frost attacks went out and brought frost magic wands to help do frost damage to the boss in hopes that it would freeze, and then sit back as the physical damage dealers popped all their cooldowns in hopes of doing enough damage to break the ice and kill it. This wasn't the only fight in vanilla where some classes and specs were just straight up useless, but it was one that had the greatest amount of useless specs and classes. Number 3 on this list is Lord Ryloth from Firelands. There seems to be a pattern where some of the best raids in the game also have at least one boss that is just terrible. This fight is where Blizzard actually admitted that it was a badly designed fight. According to them, it sounded like a neat idea on paper, DPS no legs to control the boss and have him step in volcanoes to take him out, but didn't work well in practice at all. You can tell Blizzard thought this fight was going to be amazing by all the detailed work they put into their original models for this particular fight, but it was actually just an annoying ad fight with a burn execute phase. On the plus side, it was one of the easier heroic bosses, so while it was a bad fight, it was usually just farm for loot like Gunship and ICC. Although it wasn't that easy. Some guilds would actually spend longer in this fight than any other boss before Majordomo, because of its extreme gimmickiness and RNG factor. Now, number 2 on this list is a fight most people watching this video might think would be number 1, and that's the worst fight in the worst raid in the game, the faction champs in TOC. Hey, what if we did PvP while doing a raid fight? Is what Blizzard was probably thinking, which doesn't sound that bad until you find out that these are NPCs with player moves, and would CC and heal like crazy. Also, they dropped aggro and couldn't be tanked, which meant your healers could die in an instant. If you did not have an arms warrior, hunter, or rogue in your group, this fight was just impossible because those were the only 3 classes with the Mortal Strike ability, because back then, Mortal Strike, Aim Shot, and Wound Poison would give a debuff that reduced healing by 50%. All in all, it was just too much of a change of pace for raiders to do a PvP style fight in PvE, and universally hated by just about everyone. What could be worse than a fight universally hated by everyone? Well, some people actually liked faction champions. Number 1 on this list is heroic Blackfuse from Siege of Orgrimmar. This fight was literally hated by everyone. You see, people actually like some of the fights I listed before, but no one liked this fight. It's a proven fact, backed up by statistical data. Why was this fight so bad? Well, if the 2 people you sent on the belts to play a game of Frogger while burning down machine parts died, it was pretty much a wipe. What's that, you say? There were one-shot mechanics on the belt that were very easy to fail to? No way. Blizzard wouldn't possibly put a mechanic like that in a game so late into its history. I mean, this is Siege of Orgrimmar. WoW has been out for almost 10 years at this point. There is no way Blizzard would put a vanilla-style mechanic where the entire raid success depended on 1 to 2 people playing a game of Frogger while doing high amounts of burst damage to moving machine parts on a conveyor belt that's constantly moving. Except that's exactly what they did. And of the 250 wipes I had in that fight, more than 200 of them were from failing to the belt mechanic. As a healer, there was nothing I could do to change the outcome of that fight, and that's what I hate about fights like this. Fights where you can play your class and do your job perfectly, and your raid members do the same, but you still lose over and over because of a gimmicky mechanic. And that's it for my top 10 worst raid bosses. Honorable mentions go out to Heroic Makorok, purely for his shield mechanic similar to Tortos. I didn't put him and a few other bosses on this list because I wanted to only have one boss from each raid, and not have too many bosses from vanilla on the list. I also didn't want to have too many bosses from any expansion, so I tried to diversify it up a bit. If you have any bosses you think were terrible that I didn't cover, go ahead and leave it as a comment. I do read nearly all my comments even if I don't actually reply to them. Or if you want to tell me how terrible my list is, go right ahead. More comments equals more viewer engagement, which equals higher search ranking by YouTube, which equals more views. That's why every YouTuber tells you to like, favorite, subscribe, and comment, because it actually does help. Help get more views, that is. Which is all that matters.